When we are truly authentic, meaning we not only understand what our talents and our motivators are, but we intentionally seek out activities that are in our fast lane in ways that feed our motivators. We show up more authentically, we are more genuine, and we are much more capable of giving and receiving trust, which, as we know, trust is one of the things that most toxic cultures
Yeah.
are completely bereft of.
Hey, it's Samantha Hartley of the Profitable Joyful Consulting Podcast. This season, we are talking about gifts and talents, strengths, skills, and expertise, and how do you discover what those are within yourself? Today's topic, we're going to talk about personality assessments for leadership, like how you discover who you are as a leader. And I've asked on someone to speak with me about this. Her name is Claire. I'll introduce her in a moment. And what she did in preparation for this episode is had me take one of her personality assessments, use that instrument to, then you'll hear her in the show, deliver the results of my assessment back to me. So over the course of this episode, we're going to talk about the way she's getting results for the organizations that she goes into using these assessments, like how they actually help her. And then what I love is that you're going to hear her deliver the results to me. And so I think watching the kind of how skillfully she explains the results to me is really amazing, because she's got a 77-page report that she's distilled down into just the specific pieces of advice that she gives me. So that's been really fun, a little vulnerable, but we all get to learn a little bit more about ourselves, and today specifically me, in the process. So I hope you enjoy this. I hope this episode is going to give you a new perspective, a fresh perspective on assessments and how you can be using them, and perhaps even the instruments that Claire is using. So with that, I'm going to introduce her. President and founder of Talent Boost, Claire Chandler specializes in aligning HR and business leaders so they can deliver strategic outcomes, both today and in the future. She taps into over 25 years of experience in people leadership, human resources, and business ownership to help leadership teams work together more effectively in less time, with less cultural resistance, so they can accelerate their business growth. Claire gets results because she's insanely easy to work with. Yay, you'll notice she's insanely easy to talk to today. Cuts through the corporate clutter, and has a simple, proven approach for assessing and accelerating organizations' growth readiness. Claire is also the author of several books on leadership and business strategy. Now, I aspire to have so many books written that I refer to them just as several, not even by their titles. So anyway, you'll love her. I had the best time talking with her. So let's meet Claire Chandler. Claire, welcome.
Thanks, Samantha. It is so great to be here.
Appreciate you so much for coming on. So my first question is, what are organizations trying to solve for when they bring you in and do assessments?
Yeah, so typically they do not bring me in, and I work with large, complex organizations, right? But they typically don't bring me in for assessments specifically. The assessments, the tools that I use, the diagnostics, if you will, are part of my toolkit that I will bring in as part of a larger solution or a larger conversation. They typically will reach out or raise their hand for help because their teams are not working as effectively together as they would like to see, right? Whether that is because it is a new combination of leaders who just don't know each other, whether that is because there's this great divide between the C-suite and the next layer of leadership, and they just don't trust each other yet, or whether there is just flat out bad performance, poor behavior that they want to address.
And why do they turn to you for that as opposed to so you come in to coach teams, yeah?
Yeah, it is the major component of what I do is to work with leadership teams to get them to work more effectively. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so why, then what's the value of an assessment versus just kind of like coming in and saying like, here's this the way this going to be and things like that?
Yeah, what I love about assessments, in particular the tools that I use, and I know there are a lot of assessment haters out there, and so I'm sure we will get to that. But what I love about integrating assessments into the conversation is that one, the assessments that I use are 100% driven by the input of the individual. So, unlike a 360-degree feedback, which is largely driven by the perspectives of how other people around you see you and your role,
Mm-hmm.
the tools that I use are completely based on the input that you put into the questionnaire. And I know that you test drove the questionnaire, and we're gonna get to that. But what I really love about that conversation, especially when you're dealing with senior level leaders, is you have a combination of people who are either more intuitive or more intellectual, right? And so this really helps you have a conversation that is balanced between the intuitive and the more data driven conversation. A lot of leaders are going to say, well, show me how you arrived at that conclusion or that insight, or what is the process you're going to take me through. And so being able to point back to data to really ground a conversation takes it out of this sort of esoteric and almost arbitrary qualitative conversation, and really grounds it in some qualitative insight.
Mm-hmm. So we're both Brene Brown fans. She's a data researcher. And the thing that was new to me, coming from a background of, there's two different kinds of research, qualitative and quantitative, and she's merging the two of those, which I thought was like amazing and impossible to do. So why is the qualitative valuable in the cases that you're using it?
I think they're both valuable because the quantitative, right, the data points, the measurements are a jumping off point, but the richness of the conversation comes around the context that we give that data.
Mm-hmm.
I think people tend to confuse using that data in a way that enriches a conversation with manipulating the data to suit a particular narrative,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I'm very intentional about how I use those sorts of diagnostic tools as a jumping off point to make, to really facilitate a richer, deeper conversation that starts at the human level.
Mm-hmm.
I really do think that that is one of the things that leaders in general, and especially when they work in teams, tend to skip over. They tend to, because they have so much on their plate and so much pressure to perform, to drive better results through their teams, and to achieve a longer term strategy, they kind of cut to the chase, right? And so when
Yeah.
they come together as a group, they go straight to business, and they start to talk
Mm-hmm.
about strategy, and they start to talk about problems, and they start to talk about tactics. And if they don't make a connection on a more human level first, they're never going to get to their long term goals. It's just not possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that a lot, and I work with a lot of people who work with teams, and so I know that there are issues in that area. I want to just take a quick step back. What is it? What was it in your background that made you interested in learning more about assessments and learning more about people in general?
So I spent the majority of my career in corporate. So I am a corporate survivor. I went out on my own entrepreneurial journey 12 years ago now, so in mid 2011. And one of my main roles within corporate was as vice president of talent development. It was my absolute favorite role in my corporate career. And so I had the occasion to bring in an outside consultant. We were putting together a lot of, high level and middle manager leadership programs. And so we integrated assessments, and that was really my first introduction about, 12, 13 years ago, to the power of what assessments can reveal and how it can open people up, right? You mentioned Brene Brown. Obviously, she is the queen of the topic around vulnerability and how leaders have to really pull that into their leadership model, not as a weakness, but as a strength, right? And what I have found about assessments from the very first time I was introduced to those tools, and by the way, I use the exact tools I was introduced to all those years ago,
Mm-hmm.
is that it invites people to get vulnerable by being more authentic. And that starts with making them really, really self aware of what makes them tick.
Mm-hmm. And how do you create within an organization enough safety for the leaders and the teams to have a conversation around it? Because I personally, you and I have shared our war stories off of this call, but I was not in a. I mean, I took the MBTI back then, the Myers Briggs, and had huge insights and really loved that, and explained many things about why I couldn't get along with people at work and certain things like that. That it was very clarifying in that way. And it was also not a safe environment to be able to discuss. Like, we went to an offsite, there was a whole seminar about it, and then we came back to work, and nobody ever talked about how to really integrate it back at the office. But even had they done that, it wasn't necessarily a safe environment for using the things that we knew. And as I say the word use, I feel like use against each other maybe.
Yeah.
So how do you find organizations and help people to use, leverage that information in ways that are, I don't know, in the highest good of all concerned instead of for career gain?
Oh, this is such a huge topic. So you just open an enormous Pandora's box, right? Because in my experience and from my perspective, both when I was within corporate and now that I serve corporate organizations as a consultant, many corporate cultures are um, they're toxic. I mean,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term, there's a reason that that term exists,
Yeah.
right? And it is for that very reason. And it is that environment that you see, that you feel, that you hear about, where large corporate organizations don't start out with this intention, but devolve to a point where they reward people throwing each other under the bus, where they penalize or stigmatize vulnerability,
Hmm.
where humility is not what will get you advanced into the corner office.
Hmm.
And so these organizations that bring me in, I am very blessed to be at a point in my consulting career where I can be picky. I can be selective about the organizations that I invite into my world, right? When you start out as an entrepreneur, that isn't the case typically. You kind of go wherever you can start to build up some revenue and some street cred and all of that. So I'm pretty selective about organizations. And what I look for is a couple of things. But one of the first things is, will the leaders at the very top participate in the events that I come in and facilitate? Because too often the C suite has very much a do as I say, not as I do mentality. And that is one of the hallmarks of a toxic corporate culture. I
Hmm.
just wrote an article for Forbes on that very subject, right? But if an organization not only will agree to fund and finance someone like me to come in, but actually participates in the retreat, in the
Yeah.
conversation, it goes a long way. So, I'm working with a few clients now where I'm facilitating what I'm calling retreats.
Hmm.
To your point, typically they are offsite. This one happens to be in one of their offices. Because I think that's another hallmark. We if we can't talk about and sort of share our stories as fellow humans unless we go far away from the office. That's kind of a symptom, right? That's sort of a
Red flag.
yeah. And so when I work with these leadership teams, the first place we start is not at the ground level. We start at the very top, because then as we are cascading this type of an experience into the middle and the lower layers of leadership, right down to the front lines, we can say with a straight face and with absolute honesty, the C suite just engaged in this. This
Hmm.
very senior level leaders participated in the exact same assessments and conversations and vulnerable sharing that you're about to do. Because I've seen it done the other way, and I've seen it where we start with middle management or even the vice president level. And one of the first things they say as they go through my process is, the higher levels of leadership really need to hear this. They really need to go through this process.
Right.
So if I can stand in a room of leaders and say, we did start there, it goes, much further, and it is a much smoother road to deepening and strengthening their culture.
Fabulous. Can you share with us an example of just the whole case study of like why they brought you in, what you did, how you used the assessments, and kind of like what the revelations were, and how that changed the organization that you worked with?
Yeah, absolutely. So about 6 months ago, a pretty large, complex, multi-billion-dollar organization reached out to me and said, we recently merged two companies, and these two legacy companies could not have been more different in their culture. One was very entrepreneurial, one was very bureaucratic. One was very, improvisational and innovative. The other one had a lot of best practices and structure. So the combination made sense in terms of blending the best of both worlds.
Right.
But they were still legitimately surprised that not everybody got along and not everyone saw eye to eye or knew how to make decisions, solve problems, or build strategy, let alone execute it, on the same page. So they
Yeah.
said, can you come in? Can you get our leadership team aligned? Because we need to build out our strategy and they need to execute it. And so they originally called me to facilitate a strategic planning workshop. And I said, happy to do it as day 2. Day 1, however, we need to do some team building. And you asked a question earlier, why do people call me specifically? They could have reached out to someone to do some team building workshops where they go walk in the woods and they talk about their feelings and they, do all those things. And those are wonderful, but they're not connected to the business. Or they could hire a consultant to come in and just build out their strategic plan. And it might be rock solid, but they've got no chance of executing it because the people are not on the same page. They don't trust each other. They're not vulnerable with each other, right?
Right.
And so for someone like me to be able to come in and do some of that team building up front that moves them closer to being able to work together on business, and then on the back end of that, come in and build out a strategic plan from a place of trust, it's much more powerful, right?
For sure.
And so for this particular company, that's what they said. I said, day 2, all about strategic planning, totally fine. Day 1, this is what we need to do. And it has to start with the C-level leader who had brought me in. So that particular leader and the senior vice presidents of the organization, we got them all in the same room. Prior to that, they went through the assessment questionnaire that you recently completed. And I had a one-on-one sort of insights and strength planning conversation with them. And I'm going to, do a very condensed version of that at some point during this conversation for you. But I like to do that one-on-one for a couple of reasons. One, because I want to raise the individual self-awareness of what makes them tick, what drives them, why they show up the way they do, et cetera. But it's also selfishly for me as a consultant, it helps me warm up the room, right?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
helps me understand before I walk into the room really where the biggest cracks and fissures are.
Mm,
And so when we do this pre-work and these pre-conversations, now I can walk in with eyes wide open
uh-huh.
because while I have a very tried and true consistent approach, there's still a bespoke element, right? Because I have to meet people where they are. And so this company in particular, I walk into the room and I'm setting up, and as each leader comes in, they go and pick a seat around the table. And I dabble a little bit in sociology back in my college days. So I'm always curious, like where people sit in a room. And if on day 2, they go exactly back to that same seat they had on day 1, which typically they do.
Yeah.
And as every leader walked in, they didn't really talk to each other. And if they did, it was just some business tactical detail that they wanted to sort of, line up on. So I'm like, okay, here we go.
Mm,
So the first day was all about strengthening the team, unpacking as a group some of the insights from the individual assessments, really talking about, and to your point, creating an environment, a safe environment where they could be vulnerable and it was okay. Because
mhm.
remember also, we had the C-level leader in the room going through the same process as well. This was not a case of do as I say, not as I do. This was not a case of I got to where I am without any of this type of development and I don't need it now. This was someone who was walking the talk.
Mhm.
So keep in mind what I said about how they walked into the room in day 1. By the end of day 1, they were laughing with each other. They were respectfully joking around and teasing each other. We all went out to dinner as a group and they were practically vacuuming around us at the end of the night because nobody wanted to leave.
Wow.
And then day 2, we were at a much better place. And there were some major, major breakthroughs around strategic planning as well, which I won't bore you with. But for me, to witness that transformation where they came in suspicious strangers and they left, maybe not best friends, but they connected on a human level to the point where they were actually joking around with each other, which you hadn't seen before that.
Yeah. Amazing. And do you have any information about how that translated into the business?
Well, So again, I won't bore you with all the details of day two, but what was really interesting with day two was, and again, I have a very tried and true kind of consistent approach for taking someone through how to build a strategic plan, how to, how to gain buy-in through the co-creation process. And they walked into day two, they were like literally rolling up their sleeves. They knew day two was all about kind of bulletproofing the longer term strategy. And they took over. And what I mean by that is we were going through this sort of systematic process of breaking down, okay, if this is where you want to be in 5 years, how do we back that up and kind of identify milestones? They all got together and they started to collaborate and they started to whiteboard and flip chart, what that needed to look like. And they started to negotiate with each other the trade-offs, right? Because these are very high level leaders with their domain of expertise and responsibility. And rather than, if we hadn't done day one, they would have come in defending their turf. Instead, on day two, they were like, okay, this is what's important to me in my vertical, but it means that there's some dependencies here under your vertical. Let's negotiate where that best falls and what the implications are. And so halfway through that second day, I literally took a step back and I just watched it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the most powerful moments for me as a facilitator, because and as I've said to them, and I say to every room I'm in when I'm doing this type of work, I am the least important person in the room. I am there to help create an environment where you can then pull out of yourselves the best of what you are, the best of what you know, and how you're going to combine that in a more cohesive and collaborative way. But for me to be able to witness that all coming about was so tremendously powerful, because they all knew where they had to get to within 5 or 10 years, but they didn't necessarily know the steps or how they were going to kind of work together and lean on each other and their teams to kind of get closer to that goal. So by the end of that second day, not only did they have more clarity around where they needed to be long term, they had more buy-in to that, because now they could see how they in fact could get there.
What would you say about the range of detractors?
Yeah, detractors typically are folks who have used some type of assessment or diagnostic in the past and have been burned by them in some way, shape, or form. Either they didn't like the answers that they got for themselves personally, or they misunderstood or misused the data, right? And so one of the things that I find so powerful about the particular tools that I use, and before anyone in your audience thinks, I'm gonna do a sales pitch for my particular tools, it's not even as much about the tools that you use, but it is very much how you understand and how you apply them. The tools that I use in particular are what I call DISC on steroids. And so if you are familiar with the DISC profile, which is a behavioral profile that sort of measures how you tend to show up in the world in your most natural state versus your adaptive state, that is a tool that is incorporated into this particular, or it's an index incorporated into this particular tool, but it's just one of the three. And to me, it's the least interesting one. And I'll explain that when we kind of unpack this. But to the point that detractors raise about, well, these tools are so easy to manipulate. This particular tool, first of all, and I could bore you with the hundreds of pages of validation studies that this is actually EEOC compliant and culturally agnostic and all of that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, leaders just want to know, is it something that's going to help me drive better decisions? Is it something that's going to help people perform better and behave more positively? And the answer is yes, if you use it in the right way and you're open to the process. These particular tools are extremely hard to manipulate. The tools that I use are extremely hard to fix, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I always emphasize is before you sit down to take the online questionnaire that feeds into this very detailed report that you get, understand two things. One, it's going to take you about 10 or 15 minutes. And two, if you are distracted, if you are multitasking, and or if you are pausing too long to try to think about, well, how would my boss want me to answer this question? You are not going to get the value out of it that you want to. Will it still be valid? Most likely, yes. I have seen a very, very small percentage of findings reports end up being invalid. And when I poke and prod the person who took the questionnaire, they will admit, yeah, I was kind of I started the questionnaire and then I took a call, and then somebody was standing at my door and I was talking to them. So there's a way that you can kind of like mess up your own results,
Mm-hmm.
but by and large, it is an extremely powerful tool. And like I said before, what is so powerful about it is 100% based on the input that you give it versus say a 360-degree feedback, which is, largely or
Yes.
almost entirely based on how other people view you and your role.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which can also be like good or bad. Um,
Absolutely.
Cool. So with that, we'll transition. You sent me the assessment that you use with your clients, and I took it, and it did not take me 10 to 15 minutes. It took me much more, like 30-ish and more minutes, because
Really
I'm a,
interesting.
di-
Okay.
I'm much more, I'm like a decision fatigue person. So I was like, I don't know. I didn't, I wouldn't say multitask, but I did like, I'm going to leave that window and I'm going to go and I'm going to come back to it, because that's probably processing. It's probably a way that I process that might be different, but I felt that my answers were their most accurate. But I could see in there's a lot of questions about like charitable giving, for example, which I felt like, I probably should answer that I should volunteer more, or that I should give more. And then, I can see how somebody would be like, I think probably if I thought my boss was going to see that, I would be like, sure, volunteering and moving that up. So I don't know if you have a lot of these will self-correct. They'll have kind of conflicting questions so that
Right.
uh, it'll wash that out. But in any case, uh, what about that?
Yeah. So this particular tool certainly will, and as you just recently took the questionnaire, you probably know this. It tends to ask you different questions, or has you think about or evaluate different statements multiple times.
Right.
And that is part of the design of that, right? Is to sort of root out or engineer out the human tendency to want to please others with the results. And, again, as I said before, there's a very small percentage of the time that I have seen a report that just kind of comes out, that's really not valid. And there's ways that I can see it just in the report. And then, of course, when I have a conversation, which is one of the reasons I like to have these conversations, is to really enrich, like I said before, data is great as a jumping off point. The value that you get out of a tool like this or any assessment tool is the conversation that it helps to facilitate.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you took the questionnaire, even if you found yourself going, okay, this is the way that I should value things, or this is the way that I should feel about X, Y, and Z, the tool does kind of randomize how it asks you questions repeatedly, so that
Mm-hmm.
it can sort of flatten out that tendency to want to please others with your answers. And
Mm-hmm.
and let me just sort of qualify that as well. There's no right or wrong profile here, right?
Yeah.
One of the reasons that people are detractors against assessments, especially with DISC, is because it has been so misused. There was
Mm-hmm.
this urban legend or this urban myth that
Mm-hmm.
only high Ds were
Yeah.
natural born
Be
leaders,
leaders.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and so that you've heard that.
Yeah.
That has long since been debunked. The
Mm-hmm.
the value of any sort of assessment, the tools that I use, certainly, but many others that are out there, whether it's Myers Briggs or Kobe or et cetera, um, is to use the tool first as a jumping off point for a richer conversation, but really the design of the tool is to raise self awareness. There's a whole body of science called axiology behind the particular tool that I use, and it came out of and it was born out of this study of genius level performers. So if you look through the span of history at all the people that we would consider geniuses, um, what do they have in common? And this particular study found that there are two traits that all genius level performers share. It's self-awareness, right? Of what comes naturally to me, what I am motivated to do with those talents and how I tend to show up in the world. And it's authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And Brene Brown would love that conversation, right? Because it kind of hints toward that vulnerability. When we are truly authentic, meaning we not only understand what our talents and our motivators are, but we intentionally seek out activities that are in our fast lane in ways that feed our motivators. We show up more authentically, we are more genuine, and we are much more capable of giving and receiving trust, which, as we know, trust is one of the things that most toxic cultures
Yeah.
are completely bereft of.
Mm. Yeah. Agree. Zero. Um,
Yeah.
and I refer often to the armor that I wore, both literally and metaphorically, when I was at corporate. Cool. So let's jump in to the assessment that I took for you and what it told you about me.
Awesome. Okay. So, as I said, this is kind of DISC on steroids. So, this tool that I use incorporates three different indices. The first one is DISC, and it sounds like you've done DISC
Hmm.
profiles in the past. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and like I said, there is this myth that only high Ds are natural born leaders. The other myth is that your DISC style is hardwired, meaning
Hmm.
that however your DISC sort of reveals that you show up in the world is static. It never changes over time. And we now know that not to be true. But in your case, you are, at least right now, at this evolution of your life, you are both a pure D and a pure I.
Hmm.
And so, what that means, and it doesn't sound like that surprises you,
No.
you tend to be extremely decisive when dealing with problems.
Hmm.
And you also tend to be extremely outgoing and optimistic when dealing with people.
Yes.
Do both of those seem true?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And so I often see a pure, and when I say pure, you're 99 out of 100 on both of those
Oh, really?
bars. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe you always have been, more than likely you have evolved over time, depending
Yeah.
on kind of where you are in your evolution, in your life, in your career, et cetera.
Hmm.
But so I quite often see a pure, as in a 99 in one of these letters, D, I, or S, or C. I
Hmm.
rarely see a 99 in two of them.
Oh, okay.
So you're not quite a unicorn, but you are very, very unique
Uh-huh.
in that you are both very, very decisive, very driven toward results,
Hmm.
but you are equally driven by the experience that people have. Um,
Yes.
Not terribly surprising then, but that you love hosting podcasts, right? Because you
Hmm.
are very, just even in our pre-conversations, you were very focused on, making sure that this experience was one that, both you would enjoy, but that I would, enjoy as well.
Good. Profit and joy.
Profit
Sounds
and
like
joy.
a
There you
little D
go.
and a little I.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. The other part of DISC that's kind of interesting for you is you are very low on C.
I know.
So yeah, so
Not
typically,
conscientious at
yeah,
all.
so typically that means that you are very challenging of
Hmm.
the status quo, right?
Hmm.
You are not somebody who has likely ever said, "Well, that's the way it's always been done."
Yeah.
You are completely the opposite of that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Don't care at all about how it's been done.
Awesome.
But I would say that the way in which I'm sure what we would get into this, but if you were coming into my company, is I do bring people onto my team who have those qualities,
Yep.
because I do think that I do value the not just the challenging the status quo, but conscientiousness in general. I do think is important.
Absolutely. Well, you've got to have somebody who sort of, focused first on quality, on measuring what has gone before, and let's not just throw out the baby with the
Yeah.
bathwater, right?
Right.
Let's sort of
Yeah.
lean
Let's slow
on what
down.
worked. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But
Yeah.
if that's not how you prefer to show up, then that's not where you want to focus.
Right.
100%. Okay. So the second of the three indices that my particular tool kind of evaluates is called a values index.
Hmm.
So this particular tool categorizes our internal reward system into seven main buckets of motivators. And not all of them are necessarily ones that feed you uniquely, but there are ones for you that are very high. So you have very high value categories under individualistic and theoretical, which means
Hmm.
you tend to be someone who is extremely motivated by doing things your own unique way. The Frank Sinatra "Did It My Way" is almost your theme song, right?
Uh-huh.
You very much like to do things your own way, and you also feel rewarded when you are recognized for the uniqueness that you bring to the table.
Cool.
Okay, does that
Yes.
resonate?
Absolutely.
Great. And the other one that's super high for you is theoretical. So, and I totally relate. I'm super high on theoretical as well. So, we love to learn. We
Hmm.
love to acquire knowledge. We love to learn for the sake of learning. It doesn't matter whether we can apply that learning right away, I happen to be an avid reader. You are likely one as well. I contrast that with somebody who's very low on theoretical, who is only going to be motivated to learn something new if they can apply
Hmm.
it right away. So picture that person on the plane
Yeah.
on their flight to Italy,
Hmm.
reading through their foreign language phrase book, just to sort of be able to navigate the streets, get to their hotel, and order a meal.
Hmm.
You're more likely the type of person who might say, next week I think I'm going to study Italian just
Yeah.
because, right?
Right. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So those
And
are
it would,
two things that really super motivate you.
yes, I love them. I love ideas
Awesome.
and
And
learning.
yeah, and again, sort of the theory behind this particular index is the more you can feed your motivators, the things that
Hmm.
refill you, the more you're going to feel fulfilled and energized at the end of the day rather than drained, right?
Good. Good.
So now let's talk about
Fabulous.
the third index, because the third index is really, really interesting. So the third one is called an attributes index. And it's built around the theory that we all take in data and information about the world around us through three main filters.
Hmm.
Empathy, which is a measure of how naturally or how instinctively we read the room and understand the impact of a situation or decision on other people. Practical thinking, which is how naturally or how readily we can see multiple solutions to any given problem. And systems judgment, which is a measure of how naturally or how instinctively we can see how things fit into a bigger picture. Okay. And we
Hmm.
all take in data through these three lenses. We typically take in that data in a particular order, right? Through one of those lenses first. And typically, for most people, one of those lenses is going to come in last. And so, this is something unlike DISC that is fairly hardwired.
Hmm.
So, for you, your fast lane, the one that is the highest for you of those three dimensions, is practical thinking, which
Hmm.
typically means you are a natural born problem solver. So, what's interesting about that is when you look at that in combination with your disc being such a pure D, you
Yeah.
are somebody who is very results driven. You can very readily see multiple solutions to a given problem. But because you're also a pure I, you balance out that tendency to be a bull in a china shop,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. When I hear D, I think it stands for the D word, which describes many of the men that I have worked with.
Well, and that was part of the myth too, right? The D must mean that other D word.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I always look at these three in combination, these three indices, because if you just use DISC,
Yeah.
it's interesting but not terribly actionable. And if you
Right.
misuse DISC and think, oh, you're a pure D, that means you're a natural born leader and no one else is, then you're
Hmm.
going to miss the value that your other people around you bring.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
Now, what's interesting is you said just earlier, when you bring people onto your team, you're very intentional about balancing your DISC out.
Hmm. Yeah.
This attributes index around these three dimensions of empathy, practical thinking, systems judgment is really where you can focus on balancing out your team, right?
Hmm.
Because the
Hmm.
theory is the more you can spend time in your fast lane, which for you
Hmm.
is solving problems, and then look to someone on your team to operate in their fast lane, right? So
Hmm.
looking for somebody whose empathy dimension is the highest or whose system judgment is the highest.
Hmm.
As you build teams, as you make key decisions, making sure that you've got those other perspectives to balance you out, one,
Hmm.
um, tends to ensure that you're going to make a better decision because it's more well balanced. And two, it means that you don't have to slow down to make sure that you're also reading the room. Even though you can, you've got a very good ability to do that. Plus, it's
Hmm.
important to you because you're such a pure eye, and that the solution that you so readily see is the one that's going to help move the needle closer to the bigger plan. So
Hmm.
finding people on your team or in your network who have those as the fast lanes while you stay in yours, then you're off to the races and you're super productive. And when you do that in ways that also feed your motivators, you kind of like, it's days like that where when you're looking back at your day with your glass of wine or your glass of tea or whatever, going, man, today it was such a fulfilling day. I was in my zone, right? People talk about that all the time. Typically, it's because not only are they operating their fast lane, they're doing it in ways that feed their motivators.
Hmm. So the fast lane would be the problem solving, and the motivators would be the how would you describe those again?
Yeah, so your motivators are individualistic, so doing things
Hmm.
in your own unique way,
Hmm.
theoretical, where you also get to constantly learn. So for you, the more you can spend your day solving problems, coming up with solutions, doing it in unique ways, and in
Mm-hmm.
ways where you're also learning and acquiring knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Those are like your magical days.
So that sounds right. So does that describe that I'm constantly solving new problems, or where I feel like there's kind of like a novelty aspect in here somewhere with the learning.
Yeah, so you have a natural ability to solve problems, whether they're old problems, new problems, novel problems. For you, though, the ones that motivate you the most are the ones where you get to solve them uniquely and you get to
Mm-hmm.
solve novel problems where you learn something new for yourself.
Mm-hmm. So does it imply that there needs to be a lot of kind of change, newness, um, dynamic nature to my work, or is this mostly at work or my life in general?
It's typically your life in general. It does not mean that you have to swirl about a lot of change all the time. It could just mean that you're solving existing problems or old problems in new ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you have
Mm-hmm.
such a natural ability to solve problems, because you're the type of person who can walk into a room and when people are kind of scrambling around, how do we fix this? You can see multiple ways to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you just had a pure D but a low I, you would say, get out of my way. I'm going to do it myself because
Uh-huh.
you want to get the result,
Yeah.
right? But because you're also a pure I, you want to make sure that everyone else understands why you are advocating for that particular solution. And you want to do it in as
Mm-hmm.
quick a way as possible because you're so results driven.
Mm-hmm.
But you also want the people on your team, as an example, or in your family, as another example, to have a good experience in the solving of that problem,
Got it.
right?
Got it.
So that's great for everybody else.
Yeah.
And for you as a leader to be mindful and aware of that. But for you personally, if you can do that in a new, unique way, even if it's an old problem, and in a way where you get to learn something new through the process, you're going to feel more fulfilled.
Fabulous. Fabulous. That sounds good. So, you mentioned that the third part of the assessment was covered three separate areas. Can you go over those again? There was
Yes. So the three in the attributes index, yes. So the
yeah.
three filters are empathy,
Mm-hmm.
ability to read the room, practical thinking, ability to see multiple solutions to a given problem, and systems judgment, which is
Mm-hmm.
ability to see the bigger picture.
Okay. And which one of that did I have?
So your fast lane is practical thinking.
Got
So
it.
think of that as problem solving, tactics, getting
Yeah.
results.
And just to bring in another personality assessment, I am a Virgo, so that
Oh,
fits
there you go.
in. So what are the vulnerabilities in my work style, the weaknesses, the things that I need to shore up, either that I need to kind of work on for myself, be aware of for myself, or that I just don't even need to work on, I just need to bring in team for? Because to me, those are two different things.
Yep,
There's
love
the
it.
things that you're not going to change, but you need to know about yourself. And then there's the things that it's like, well, here's some
Yep,
personal
love it. Okay,
growth.
so I'll start with the attributes index first. So, as I said, your brain kind of processes information through those three lenses in a particular order. And so, for you, the first place your brain goes is solving the problem. The third place your brain goes is systems judgment. So, when you look at these dimensions side by side, that one is the lowest number of the three. Now, in your particular case, it's still very high. So, it's on a scale of 1 to 10. Your practical thinking is a 9.3. Your systems judgment is an 8.3. Still
Oh,
very
wow.
high, which means that
Mm-hmm.
you're still taking in a lot of data from that lens. But
Mm-hmm.
because your practical thinking lens or filter is so loud in your brain, your systems judgment may tend to get drowned out. And
Mm-hmm.
so, where that really comes into play is in what we call a high velocity environment, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
think kind of work mode. A lot of
Yes.
things are flying at you. The faster you have to make a decision, the more likely your brain is going to naturally and unconsciously go towards solving the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the third place your brain is going to go, if it gets there at all, because you have to make a decision so quickly,
Mm-hmm. Is
is this
empathy.
solution the one that's going to move the needle toward the grander long term plan, right?
Okay.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean you don't have the capability to think systematically or strategically. It just means that if you don't have the luxury of slowing down to process the decision equally across all three of those measures, the bigger system, the bigger plan, the more, the grander strategy may get drowned out, right?
Mm-hmm. Got
And
it.
so it's what we call a blind spot. In your case, given your numbers, it's not a weakness per se, but if you had to spend your entire day thinking very high level, thinking strategically, putting together the plan,
Mm-hmm.
you would feel a drag. right? Because
Interesting.
your brain has to slow down a little bit more to
Hmm.
be thinking in that lane because your brain just naturally wants to solve problems.
Got it. So that's so uh, ironic because I actually love strategic thinking, and like I would say, 90% of my work with my clients is on doing that. So, is there a way that I have maybe turned high? You know, I'm queen of the phrase "zoom out." Like, let's zoom
Yeah.
out. Let's go up here and do this thing, and we create strategies and plans. And I feel like I'm much more enervated by kind of like details and down here and like whatever. So, is there a way that I've kind of conflated maybe problem solving with strategic thinking?
I wouldn't say you've necessarily conflated it because again, you have a high degree of clarity around systems judgment. So you do have that capability. What you are likely doing is because you've been at this a while, you know enough that if you really want to serve your clients in a more strategic way, you have to make space and you have to make time, right?
Hmm.
If you're under the gun and you have to rapid fire make a decision, you're much less likely to have your strategic hat on. You're going to have your problem solving hat
Got it. Got
on,
it.
right?
So, is that a stress behavior?
So the stress behavior really comes in with your disc, right? And
Hmm.
so that's kind of the second part of the answer to your question of, is there a weakness? Is there a vulnerability that you need to be aware of? And
Hmm.
so disc, since you've done this before, you know that there's kind of two elements to disc, right? There's a natural and there's an adaptive.
Hmm.
And so your natural disc style again is pure D, pure I, really low C. Your adaptive on D drops significantly.
Uh-huh.
And so what that means is when you are in, it's not so binary as saying, how am I at home versus work? But it's
Hmm.
really when I'm in my state of flow, right? When I'm in my zone and I am completely comfortable with how I'm showing up in the world. I'm a pure D and I'm a pure I. When you feel like you're being observed, when you feel like you're more in work mode or under the gun, you're adapting your D so it drops from a 99 to a 49.
Wow.
Right. And so that means you get far less aggressive.
I'm less bossy at home.
Well, I mean, right. So when you're natural, like when you're in your natural state of flow, it's not
Uh-huh.
so much bossy because
I know, I'm
remember,
teasing.
it's a measure of how you deal with problems, not with people.
Hmm.
Your eye is about how you show up with people. And you're very consistent with your eye, right? You don't really adapt that noticeably. But your D, when you're more in work mode, so
Hmm.
let's just say hypothetically that it's when you're in working with client mode,
Hmm.
you ratchet down the aggression, right? So when
Hmm.
you tackle problems with or for a client, you're going to be far less aggressive. So I think to
Hmm.
your point, that's where you're seeing your adaptation of your natural
Hmm.
style is not so much slowing down to give my brain time to catch up on strategy because again, you see strategy with a very high degree of clarity. It's how you're adapting, how you're showing up
Hmm.
toward the problem. But
Got
again,
it.
you're so interactive, you're so outgoing, you're so optimistic when dealing with people, whether you're not, in your natural or your adaptive state. It's you're showing up with problems that you ratchet down the aggression when you're dealing with clients.
Got it.
Does that all make
Cool.
sense?
It does make sense. So, who should I hire?
Your next hire should be someone who's fast lane of systems judgment.
Hmm.
Okay. Does not necessarily mean they have to be in a role where they are your chief of strategy, but they should be someone whose daily activities involve building plans, putting together more of a long term, or at least being that voice in the room when you have to make a key decision on does this fit into where we're trying to get to? Does this fit into the bigger picture in a
Hmm.
more cohesive way?
Got it.
Right. So think about that, especially for your what I would call your inner circle.
Hmm.
You want to look for somebody, somebody else, like the little voices on your shoulder, one who's thinking about the bigger plan and one who's reading the room. And again, it's not because you don't have the ability to do those things. It's
Hmm.
because your practical thinking is so high it's going to drown out the other two.
Got it.
Okay.
Interesting. So I was fascinated by the three areas because you talked about the empathy, and I would consider myself fairly much an empath, but that doesn't seem to be kind of coming through in any of these results. That kind of like hypersensitivity or any of emotionality. None of that am I hearing here. Is it?
Well, so you have a very strong empathy filter.
Mm-hmm.
You have a very strong ability to read the room. You are also someone though who tends to keep your professional and your personal lives separate.
Mm-hmm.
That I can see in your dimensional scores as well.
Interesting.
But again, remember that you are such a pure I that not only do you have a high degree of empathy, but you sort of have, you've got borders, or not barriers, I would say, but there's lines that you won't cross, right?
Hmm.
But because you're such a pure I, that's how that's showing up. You are constantly driven by getting results, and let's talk about it in work mode, getting
Hmm.
results for your client and making sure that they have as good of an experience as possible.
Cool. It is true that I have a very different kind of public self and private self. And my husband has come on in the hermit episode. We talked about that. The reason I have hermit archetype and no one knows it is because I'm very forward, like a lot of other hermits. Some hermits are just like very introverted and they're always kind of that way. But there are those who are kind of extroverted, big outgoing personalities like mine, where part of the reason we have hermit is because we're so on that we
Yep.
need to kind of like recede and go to and have nothing in order to recharge. So I think that does make a lot of sense.
And
Um,
keeping in mind the recharge piece, right? Because you likely, because you're such a pure I, and because you do see empathy very clearly, even though your problem solving is kind of your dominant, where your brain goes first. Because I often kind of think about that, when I'm out doing what I do, and my I is not nearly as high as yours. I tend to be more introverted than extroverted. My husband disagrees. He thinks I'm a pure extrovert, but that's not
uh-huh.
true. But I have what I have come to understand to be energy leaks, which means
Hmm.
that when I'm done facilitating a retreat, I kind of
Hmm.
leave it all out in the field. And then I need to, and now that I understand this, I kind of schedule time to
Yeah.
decompress, right? And one of the ways that we recharge at the end of the day, at the end of a client interaction, whatever, is to look back at what motivates us. And
Hmm.
so for you, it's doing something in a unique way, and it's your high theoretical, which for you is very high. So if you ever struggle with, I'm doing what I love with people that I love, the way that I want, and that's wonderful, but I'm still so like I've got no energy left for my family at the end of the day,
Hmm.
keep in mind that what's going to refill your cup is learning, not necessarily professionally, right? It doesn't mean
Yeah.
we always have to refill our professional cup. We need to
Hmm.
refill our human cup. And so for you, it's let me go and learn something that has nothing to do with work, or let
Yep.
me just go and do something in a bizarrely different way than I've ever done just because,
Yeah.
right? For
Yeah.
you, that's going to refill you.
Totally accurate. Yes. The funnest thing I did last year was I took a class that was on Sunday afternoons. It wasn't Italian, but it was Italians leading the class in just like a little, um, kind of a. It's hard to even describe what it was, but it was the kind of thing that totally like was the most rejuvenating thing I did
Not work related at
in
all,
the fall.
sounds like. Yeah.
Not even, like I think, what I hear about what you're saying and what comes up for me is I do think a lot of business people are like, how can I monetize this? How do I, whatever. And I love that what you highlighted was that there are like at work, I will say that at work, when people are kind of like multi-passionate, I'm going to try to have them focus because I want you to be rich. And a lot
Yeah.
of the ways that we get rich are by like focusing and not like
Yeah.
being this multi-passionate and like,
Which is
hey,
how you're reining in your pure D. That's you adapting your D down to be less aggressive. Because otherwise, you're going to be like, listen, the solution is this. Just shut up and just do it the way I tell you, right? Because you're a pure I and you want them to have a
yeah,
good experience. So you're
right,
kind
right.
of dialing back how you're showing up in the face of problems with your clients. Absolutely.
You're describing me at like 27. I was much more of the shut up and do it my way.
Yeah.
So we do evolve. Fabulous. So just super fascinating and interesting. And I really so appreciate you sharing this. And I hope when others hear this, well, two things. One is that they think of the value of hearing this information. I think especially when we're earlier in our careers, especially if you're feeling like I'm not sure where I should focus. And also, I think the point that you made about like the things that I should be invigorated for my work, and yet I'm feeling a little drained from this. Like understanding that recharging. Like when I do take a hermit day, I'm very often like I am reading things that are interesting to me that are completely different, and it's not novels, but it's my version of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so where can people find out more about taking this assessment and working with you and what you do?
Yeah, I would love that, and just to sort of make the invitation very explicit, if anyone else in your audience would like to test drive this for no charge and no obligation, I am more than happy to let people do that.
So
Two
generous.
best way, yeah, two best ways to find me: clairechandler.net. is my main website. So you can learn more about me, my work, and how you might work with me if you so choose. And also find me on LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn quite a bit. I do a lot of posts there. So reach out, connect, follow, send me a message. I love to get messages just out of the blue. So please don't be shy.
Awesome. Awesome. I do too. I agree with you. LinkedIn should be more like that. People having fun. It's been such a pleasure, Claire. I loved hearing about your work and how it transforms organizations. And, I'm all about helping people who are working at those corporations that you and I left and didn't look back. I want them to be happier and doing better at them. And so I love that your work is helping them to do that. And I hope that my clients who also help them to do that can take your assessments and just make things better for those poor people back at corporate. And that we can all know ourselves better. And by doing so, have more profitable and joyful consultancies. Thanks for watching. I'd appreciate if you'd like this episode. And if you enjoyed the show, why not subscribe? Be sure to click the bell to get notified when new episodes drop.